Hello and welcome to the next session on the managerial problem solving course. We're going to talk about real world problem solving skills in this case. Okay, so when we talk about real world problem solving skills, a lot of the time what we're really trying to talk about is the difference between what happens in theory and what happens in practice. Now in reality there is no difference because it's all one big mess, right? But I think in a lot of cases with managerial problem solving, what happens is that the real world problems are something that theory forgets. Like we make models or explanations. So theories are basically explanations of problems and ways to manage them. So a theory is supposed to try and explain something of what happens. But there's three key things that are forgotten when we talk about real world problem solving in comparing to theorizing about problem solving, as Simon did in our first lecture. The first one is variance. Now, variance is difference. So real world problems are different every time we encounter them. So it's very hard actually, not quite possible to theorize about a real world problem because we can never get the issue of variance straight in our own minds. The second one is novelty. And because variance means difference, by the way, so novelty is the next part of that, which means they're unique every time that they manifest. As a manager, as I'm sure most of you are, think about the times that problems have come across your desk that was something that you'd never done before, never handled before. Problems are also unique and novel, and the word there that often combines those two is emergent. So in other words, as we do things on a daily basis, our problem solving capabilities are tested because we meet new problems every day. Now we meet a lot of the same problems. So the same problems with the same solutions and the same possible outcome. That doesn't mean that we need to make new solutions every time. What it means is that we need to have our patterns established, challenge those patterns all the time, but also have a set of new ideas every time. And what I'm going to demonstrate in this lecture is the idea of developing a conceptual ability to solve problems. So last lesson was about problem structuring, or learning to get the problem into a shape. The next one takes it a step further and says, well, how do we conceptualize from that structure? And how do we take that structure and begin to explore the issues around solving the problem? So we're going to talk about that in this session. So the next part is there's a problem with problems. What do I mean by that? Well, problems are emergent in the everyday world. They have no fixed point at which you can isolate them and say, this problem I've seen before. Now, there are problems that you will see before, but the more you get along in management, the more conceptually difficult problems become. In the reading that I've asked you to look at, it's about an engineering study, but I think it's applicable to every particular problem-solving event that you'll face as a manager. The first part of that is looking at problems from the point of view that they occur on a daily basis, that they're unique, that they're ubiquitous, and that they sometimes occur in packs or patterns, as we'll explain later. But the most important thing that I can give you in this lecture is the idea of intersubjectivity. Put simply, the idea of intersubjectivity means that problems are related to different perceptions that people have of them. So if we take, for example, the issue of the housing crisis that we've dealt with throughout this course, when we look at it from the angle of intersubjectivity, what we're saying is different people have different ideas about what the housing crisis actually is. So some people think it's caused by greed. Some people think it's caused by the economic conditions. Some people think it's caused by all kinds of things. The reality for the manager is that he or she has to pick a bunch of solutions from the available ones and run with something. So here is where theory stops being useful and reality starts to kick in. Now, it is the continuum of the same thing. We as managers are faced with a big problem, and that is causal efficacy. We have to pick things that work in reality. We do not have the choice to theorize and conceptualize for too long. So there's a process that we go through. We conceptualize the problem. We then identify out of that conceptual structure or those ideas. Another way of saying that is we create an idea of what the problem is. We then take that idea and we begin to justify that and trying to get political support for some kind of solution. Now, when we talk about the intersubjectivity, that means that different managers have different ideas of what the problem could be. So because there's different ideas, we have to settle on one, pick one, and solve it. So it makes sense to spend a lot of time conceiving of what the problem could be, on reflecting on its ability to manifest in your organization. Put simply, we need to think about what the problem is with the problem, and we need to reflect on that and turn it around and look at it from multiple viewpoints. If we don't and we just zone in, we're going to make a classic mistake, which I'll explain in just a few slides' time. It's not a linear process like in the traditional model where we go define the problem, look at the solutions, implement and reflect on those solutions. This conceptualizing process is coming up with new ideas about what the problem is because it hasn't occurred before. Because it's new, we look at the problem structure, we look at its shape, we look at the way in which we engage with it, and that particular structure then becomes part of an intersubjective process of evaluation. Or in plain English, when we look at a problem, we try and look at as many ways of explaining it as possible at the beginning so we can define it, so we can solve it. So it's a little bit backwards than traditional problem-solving theory suggests. On the fly, like for example, if we look at the Christchurch disaster, people had never faced a situation like that before. So the first thing that people do is structure the problem. Once they've structured the problem, or the problems, they begin to see the connections, and they must then pick amongst those solutions on what they think is the best. And in the process of structuring, we're conceiving or theorizing, if you like, or creating a theory of what the problem is. We then test that by acting on it. Sometimes we do it backwards. Sometimes we act first, and in the acting part, we learn about the problem. And because we've learned about it, we then go back to the structure that we have of the problem, the conceptual structure, and we begin to work through the examples of what we've got. So that's incredibly important. So what we want to do here is slow down a little bit and say all workplace problems are poorly structured. What does that mean? Well, at first glance, this seems not very right. It doesn't seem very fair, does it? But think about it. Every problem can exist within the confines of an information environment. So that means there are constraints and rules that house the problem. So if we take the average organization, we know that a manager is bound by the information that they get. We learnt that in lesson 1. The second thing we know, which we haven't explained yet, is that a manager is bound by the rules that they have. So we are only allowed to solve certain kinds of problems. This is where power and critical thinking comes into it. We need, as problem solvers, to enable creativity in our organizations to get better solutions. But quite often what ends up happening is people don't really know or understand what the difference is between conceptualizing a problem structure and working through to novel solutions for that. Because they don't understand that in organizations there are constraints, rules, and linked issues that tie a problem together. So the reality check is that every workplace problem we have has linkages to other problems, other parts of the organization, be it our supply chain, be it our operations, be it our strategy. Everything is connected together. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a functional organization. Every problem, even though it might be in a small context, is related to other parts of the organization. Therefore, we see these emergent problems coming. Another way of saying that, if we think back to the linked issues lecture, is that systemically, an organization is a connected artifact. So when we think of it from the top down, we think strategy, we think operations, we think tactics, we think daily planning, we think routine transactions, right? But a routine transaction is directly connected to the strategic view. It's all connected. There are time constraints in managerial problem solving that's often missed in the literature. You have to make a decision very quickly, and that decision has to be well conceived and has to be a good idea. And as you'll learn when we talk about wicked problems, the key management skill is knowing what solution is likely to work under the constraints or rules that you have to deal with. So the first thing in problem solving, the biggest lesson that I learned was that there's things that you can change. That's what you can tackle. There's things that you can't change. What you can't change, you have to learn to live with and work around. They're called constraints and rules. And they're also linked issues. We only have a limited amount of power and information as managers to solve problems. Therefore, we only have the ability to look at a problem from certain conceptual angles. But smart people learn how to think laterally, as you'll see in the exercise for this section. And lastly, there are time constraints. We have to make decisions quickly. An example of this I've included might be looking at a certain operational problem. So let's just say for a moment we are supply chain managers. Let's take the simulation. We have to optimize the supply chain. Well, we know that we have incomplete information about how a supply chain operates. So the first thing we must do is look at what information we have. From that, we need to design and look at the way in which the problem is defined. Key problems here include incomplete information. We don't have all the information in our supply chain. We don't know how well defined or designed our supply chain is. So we might be missing some key parts of the puzzle to see what issues are there. Thirdly, there are unanticipated problems which we can't see yet. And that's part of the reality of management, is that you must learn to respond as well as be proactive with problem solving. There's no such thing as I can solve every problem that comes my way. Some you can't. There's multiple conflicting goals. A manager might have a different goal of what the situation is to someone further up the chain or further down the chain. That conflict creates tension, and that tension leads to an inability of organizations to solve problems effectively. Multiple solutions or solution pathways. There's a lot of different opportunities to solve the problem. Each one is different. So because it's incomplete, or if we are the operations manager of a supply chain, we might have several options to optimize, but none of them may be useful to us. We may be looking at issues like redesigning the supply chain to introduce efficiency, but then that brings in the complications of an information system. Once we do that, that brings in more rules and constraints which we have to live by. So we are faced with all of these problems. So in summary, part of the issue with dealing with real-world problem solving is learning incomplete information, learning how it works, learning what bounded rationality actually means and how to challenge that. So looking at the rationality the problem exists in and learning to look at other ways of explaining it, because I think those other ways sometimes get at the heart of what a lot of issues are about, and that's the hidden assumptions that contain the root cause of the problem. Linked issues and nested issues. Nested issues are those where a problem is connected to other problems within the problem, or in the reading it says the aggregate problem. So when we have problems that are nested within bigger problems, the symptoms that we notice are actually the result of another problem. We can take the economy of India as a classic example. In India, there is a wide range of labour issues to do with poor people, and the average worker in a textile factory might earn somewhere between $1.50 and $2 a day. Now, when we look at that from the outside, we think, well, that's terrible. Those people are being ripped off and exploited. But that's one way of looking at it. Another way, which a student challenged me with a while ago, was saying, okay, they're being exploited, but if they don't work, they don't eat. So at the same time, that economy issue is nested in the cultural issues of a caste system, for example, of the legacy of the caste system. It's also in the exploitation in the fashion industry. So there's a lot of issues all of a sudden that are nested, and you can explain this problem from a bunch of different angles. Each one of them gives rise to another nested issue that's connected to another issue that's connected to another issue. So in linkage theory, we said that problems have connections that can be explained through linkages. What we're saying in nested issues is each one of those linkages leads to another set of issues. So every problem is nested. It is not an island. There are no problems where it's a simple fix, where it's not connected to some other part of an organization. And that's something that we need to be aware of. Managers, as I said, have conflicting goals. So some people want to solve the problem, other people don't want to solve the problem. There are political agendas that we need to navigate, and realities like that. The challenge of navigating political realities is to do with discourse and speaking and language and stuff like that. And that's probably something else that needs to be explored in other courses. But all problem solutions in a complex work environment are political, and it requires skill to be able to justify them. So if you're face-to-face, we'll do this exercise in class. If you're an online student, please head to the wiki and conduct this exercise. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fragmentation of knowledge. In this picture we can see that metaphor of the elephant being explained visually. All these people think the elephant's something that it's not. What is this saying? Well, a nested issue is one that comes from different perceptions of what the problem is. And now remember, as managers, we are blessed and cursed with causal efficacy. In other words, we are blessed with this idea that we have to explain things and do something about it. We have to be effective in our jobs, and we have to solve problems. That's what we're hired for. But we look at this elephant, everybody's offering a different explanation of what it is. And this is what problem solving can be like. Now, the way to turn this on its head is to say, if everybody had the same information, would they have a different perception of the problem? Often the way we've set up organisations is to create a system of knowledge fragmentation. And that's nothing more obvious than that than the average hierarchy. Different people at different levels of the organisation have different views on what the problem could be. And it might not be until we get to the top of the organisation that we see the complete picture. But what happens is, if we imagine this is one big problem, it's actually 6 smaller problems. So as manager on the left thinks it's a snake, and manager on the right I think it's a dog or something like that. What's actually happening here is the knowledge is being fragmented amongst the groups in the organisation. And without even knowing it, they're solving the same problem. I once went to a conference in Brisbane about information systems, and in there I watched three presenters present the same paper but from three different theoretical angles. One of them was talking about decision support systems, the other one was talking about knowledge management, and the other one was talking about database management. All three of them were actually working on the same problem but didn't reference each other, didn't talk to each other, and didn't even know each other. By the end of the session, I was totally amazed at how the academic world fragments knowledge and puts it into little baskets, because it's more effective to do that. Causal efficacy, it's more effective to do that than it is to actually explore how knowledge is connected. In organizations, we do exactly the same thing. We do not explore how knowledge is connected, we explore how knowledge is not connected and how it's not part of the same deal. We look at this elephant, for example. It's got 6 different things that it could be according to 6 different perceptions, but in reality, it's an elephant. In the reading, they talk about engineering problems not having one known solution, but the problem is we never look at the problem from a single frame of reference where all of these things are connected. What I've tried to give you in the linkage theory toolkit is an understanding that all problems are linked together. If you can at least draw where you think the linkages are, or explore them and do some research, then you are likely to find a clear answer to that problem. In the case of the elephant here, you're looking at it from several different angles, and you're actually coming to 6 completely wrong solutions because you're not seeing how all these issues are connected. Real world problem solving, or managerial problem solving if you like, has to acknowledge that there are different sources and pools of knowledge that can explain a problem. Not just one, but several. And the more connections you see, the more robust that solution is likely to be. I can't stress that enough. That if we keep fragmenting knowledge, we will never solve the big problems. And I go back to the issue of the housing crisis again. If we look at it from one angle, we will get one set of solutions to that problem. If we look at it from 2 angles, we'll get 2 different angles that are connected and a richer explanation. If we look at it from 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, the 10th connection will give us several different solutions there. So it's important not to fragment knowledge. It's important to see knowledge as interconnected and explainable through several different concepts at the same time. To give you an example of this, I'd like to tell a story about my own life as an academic manager. One of the things I'm responsible for is allocating teaching loads. Now, it seems quite simple. All I do is I take a formula, which is 8 hours a week, and I multiply that by 13 weeks in a teaching semester, and then I go and implement that and make it work. Now, across the organisation, there are different roles teachers play. A person can teach for their department, they can teach for the school, which is a Griffith Business School, or they can teach for the university. All 3 of those systems don't talk to each other. I had an interesting case recently where we've got a new staff member, Associate Professor of Management, and I looked at this person's workload and I thought, well, he's not actually doing anything. And then when I went to talk to another colleague who had the same problem, I realised an emerging pattern. They were being employed in different parts of the university to teach, but they're only required, according to our EBA, or our Enterprise Bargaining Agreement, to teach 8 hours a week. Now, I went and spoke to someone and they said, well, I didn't know I only had to do 8 hours, because they were actually doing several other jobs for another part of the university that didn't think it was useful to measure their teaching load. Now, because that knowledge was sucked up into the school, I never got it. So this person's workload was constantly being contested and constantly being argued about. What was happening was the knowledge from the business school was not filtering down to international business, where I'm the teaching manager. So what I found was that over a period of time I had to begin to talk to other stakeholders because the knowledge about this person's teaching load became quite complicated. It can actually get quite complicated when people teach for the university because the department has no obligation to allocate that workload. Yet, the union, which is over the entire organisation, says that a person is not required to teach more than 8 hours. So what we saw around the edges were some slippages, people teaching more, some people teaching less than they should. And it was only until we began to pull together the different sources of knowledge that we saw the problem for what it was, that workloads were being allocated by department, not by school, and certainly not across the university. So when we got that data, we were able to effectively solve the problem because we had different sources of knowledge we could draw from. And that was only because we saw the linkages between the local area, which was the department, the linkage from the department to the business school, and the business school to the broader university. Some people were teaching 16 hours, for example. So now we can rectify this problem and give these people their proper university allocated workload, because we're no longer just thinking like a department, we are thinking like a player in a university. So we can look at other parts of the university and see where this teaching is happening and regulate this workload so it's fair for this person and fair for everyone else in the department. Okay, there's several core skills that are involved in workplace problem solving. In summary, the first one is scaffolding answers. The second one is creating political solutions. Now, in the first one, scaffolding means recognizing problems and asking this question: what is a problem connected to? What is a problem connected to? Secondly, if it's connected to something, then it's connected to broader views or linkages, as we've said previously in the course. Secondly, when we look at political solutions, we have to recognize that every solution has to be approved and accepted by people. When we implement a problem solution, we are thinking at the same time, this is what people want and they've agreed to. More on that as we go through into other parts of the course. So because it's political, we need support. We need to understand the knowledge flow, as I said earlier. So where is the knowledge going? Where is it coming from that makes this problem relevant? And how do I get people to participate in agreeing to this problem solution? We'll talk about that as well. Now, these skills are very useful for us to do, and they're very useful for us to follow, but the scaffolding is the most important because it creates a process of learning through which we can see how problems are connected and then eventually come out with a really good concept or structure of the problem which allows us to work forward to solutions, as I said last week. The last part of what I want to talk about today is building a conceptual framework. So that takes process. As we scaffold the problem, or as we learn to see the connections and what it's connected to, new ways of seeing the problem become apparent. In the next session, as a lead-in, I'm going to talk about creative problem solving. And this will take the form of a 10-minute video where I explain the processes of creative problem solving. And this is where creativity comes in. The more connections you see, the more likely it is that you're going to build an effective scaffold for the problem. As you build that scaffold, you see the conceptual realities and the political solutions naturally emerge. So in this example, you can see a summary of what I've talked about so far. Once we engage our ideas, we begin to see solutions. And once we see those solutions, we begin to build heuristics or concepts for solving the problem. That then filters into a strategic map of the terrain, which allows us to see all of the possibilities, and it begins to help us to see the processes of argument that we can use to generate new solutions. This is important because problem solving is really a matter of conceptual engagement. So it begins with conceiving and conceptualization and then progresses forward to solutions. The solutions part is about 5% of what we do. 95% is learning the problem, understanding the connections, seeing the connections, what assumptions hold the problem together, and how it all feeds together to create a nice scaffold, a conceptual framework that we can draw from. Okay, navigate to the wiki and we will conduct exercise 2. If you're face-to-face, we will be doing this in class.